welcome everyone to today's presentation, Building Social and Emotional Competencies Among Students with Intensive Needs. And now I'll turn it over to our presenters to introduce themselves.
Great, thanks Eliza. Hi everyone, I'm Zach Weingarten. I'm a senior researcher with the National Center on Intensive Intervention and here at AIR, American Institutes for Research. And I'm excited to be here today. My work really spans the areas of multi-tiered systems of support and intensive intervention, as well as special education. So I'm looking forward to talking about this topic with you all today.
Great, and I'm excited to be here with you all. My name is Mara. I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm passionate about finding ways to connect social and emotional learning with other sound practices. So in particular today, I'm really excited to be speaking with you on behalf of the National Center for Intensive Intervention. Zach and I, it's our intention to provide a space today for learning that's accessible to everyone. So if there's anything we can do to make this easier for you, please feel free to let us know in the chat.
Great, so our agenda for today is to start out with an overview and provide background information about intensive intervention and social and emotional learning. And we're really intending to provide kind of a big picture look at how these two big ideas fit together, being intensive intervention and social and emotional learning. We're going to talk about some specific strategies to support students with intensive needs related to developing their social and emotional competencies. And we're going to share resources to learn more about SEL and intensive intervention. And at the end, we'll have time for a question and answer session. So that's kind of the big picture that we're looking at today. So thank you all again for being here, and we're going to get started.
So common practice in social and emotional learning, as many of you I'm sure know, is to start with an opener that allows us to sort of pause and check in with how we're doing ourselves. Our emotions tell us a lot, and it's important to take stock of them and how we're feeling frequently. So the visual on the screen, as you can see, shows 100 different feelings sorted by their degree of energy and pleasantness. Our bodies are containers for our emotions, and they affect the way that we learn and process information. So I'd like to know, how are you feeling today? You're welcome to add into the chat if you feel comfortable. I want you to take a moment just to close your eyes on your own and consider what feelings that you're having in your body right now. What is your current state? How much energy do you have? How pleasant or unpleasant does your body feel? Right now, I'm feeling grateful. I'm really excited to be here and happy to have a chance to share some knowledge and learn from you as well. I invite you to think about also the way in which how you're feeling impacts your ability to process information. Check-ins like this can be done virtually or in person, of course, with educators, students, or really with anyone. And they help to build self-awareness and highlight the connection between our feelings and our ability to engage, to learn, to make decisions, to exercise our social and emotional competencies. As we dig into the content today, I encourage you to be aware of how you're feeling, and if there's anything that you need to do for yourself so that you can take care of your own needs and stay present. So let's pause just for a moment and ask ourselves, if we took stock more frequently and we're more aware of our own feelings as educators, how might we be doing things a little differently, and in particular for students with intensive needs? Again, welcome your thoughts here in the chat. Adults modeling social emotional competencies is a key piece of effective instruction and intervention. Student motivation, as well as the conditions for learning, are strongly influenced by adult social and emotional competencies. As you well know, an optimal classroom climate is characterized by low levels of conflict, smooth transitions, appropriate expressions of emotion, respectful communication, opportunities for problem solving, focus, support, responsiveness to individual students' differences and needs. So it won't surprise you to hear that educators with strong social, emotional, and cultural competencies are better able to build strong relationships, connect with students and families, and remain regulated when tensions arise. So essentially, when we start with the adults, students benefit greatly.
And here I wanted to add in a point about the relationship of this idea to intensive intervention. I think we all recognize that special educators and teachers who work with students with intensive needs have particularly challenging jobs. And it's really important for us to consider, how SEL for these adults can be a supportive feature. We want to think about the fact that these teachers often deal with stress and burnout and exhaustion, especially teachers who are working with students with challenging behaviors, other intensive needs. And so it's really important to think about how we can benefit, we can all benefit by supporting the SEL competencies of educators. So here I wanted to take a moment to introduce this connection point between SEL and intensive intervention. So about a year ago, we developed a brief on this topic, and the kind of starting point for this brief was really questions that we received from around the country regarding the connection points between SEL and intensive intervention. And folks were interested in, how can we connect these two big ideas? We're doing a lot of work on SEL, and we know it's more important than ever given the pandemic and what we're seeing in our classrooms and our schools. And we know that many students, there's more and more need for intensive intervention as well. So folks were interested in bringing these two kind of big topics together. And there hadn't been a lot of work done really bringing these two ideas together. And so we set out just to create a brief on this topic, and that's really what led to this webinar today. And so I think I just want to emphasize that this is a starting point for this conversation. We're not going to be able to address every nuance within this conversation, but we do hope to share some learning and our thinking with you all today. So some guiding questions that we're going to talk about here on the screen are: how does SEL relate to intensive intervention? And what are some effective strategies for building the social and emotional competencies of students with intensive needs? So we're going to start, as I said, by providing some background. So when we talk about intensive intervention, we're talking about instruction and intervention that's driven by data, that's characterized by increased intensity and individualization. And this is often tier 3 within a multi-tiered system of support framework. This intervention addresses severe and persistent learning and behavioral difficulties. So we're really talking about serving a pretty small percentage of the student population, those students with the most intensive needs who need this kind of real intensive intervention. So that's just a little bit about what we mean by intensive intervention. Then on this next slide, we have some of the reasons why we need intensive intervention. And that may seem obvious to you all, but here's 3 things to think about. One is that validated intervention programs, or those tier 2 evidence-based programs, are not universally effective. So we know that there are some students for whom these evidence-based interventions are not going to be enough. These students are going to need a little bit, something more intensive, something more supportive for them. And so that's where intensive intervention comes in, because it's really, a process to intensify and support students' individual needs. Next, we know that students with intensive needs often require a lot more practice than their peers. So it can be up to 10 to 30 times as much practice as their peers to learn new academic skills or new behavioral skills. So we need to provide a space for these students to have those practice opportunities and time for them to do that. So that's really where intensive intervention comes in, to provide access to that level of practice. And then finally, this idea that for students with intensive needs, co-occurring academic and behavioral needs are really the rule and not the exception. So by that we mean many students with intensive needs have co-occurring academic and behavioral and social and emotional needs. And so we need to think about the full range of student needs when we plan interventions for these students. So really thinking broadly about students with complex needs. We can't focus on just one area. We really have to think about the broad range of student needs. And so that's where intensive intervention comes in as well. So just a little bit more about NCII's approach to intensive intervention. On the slide here, you can see that our approach is data-based individualization. And so DBI is a research-based process for individualizing and intensifying interventions for students with severe and persistent learning and behavior needs. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the DBI graphic, in which we start with that evidence-based or validated intervention program. We collect progress monitoring data to determine, if the student is responsive to that intervention. If they're not responsive, we use diagnostic data to determine, why not, why isn't the student responsive? And then we adapt the intervention and we continue to collect progress monitoring data. And so this process is not an intervention in and of itself. It's not a program or a package that you could take off the shelf, but it's really an ongoing process of using data and individualizing an intervention. So I'll turn it over to Mara for a little bit now about social and emotional learning.
Thanks, Zach. Let's dive in here and start with a shared language. Shared words matter. So a shared language or common vocabulary when we talk about social emotional learning. Zach just explained that DBI is a process. SEL is also a process, a verb, a process of developing and using skills, knowledge, behaviors, things that help adults and students identify and regulate their emotions, develop positive relationships, make responsible choices, solve problems, the way we learn to do those things. It's also a process through which we build strong relationships founded on an appreciation of similarities and differences. It is meant for everyone, and it represents skills and knowledge we use on a daily basis. Welcome thoughts in the chat here if that is similar to a definition you've heard before or different. When I think about SEL, social emotional learning, and like how it looks and what it requires, think about the practices. So this is how we define the moves or actions of educators. How are we making it happen? Instructional practices that promote cognitive as well as social and emotional outcomes. This includes, interactions that result in deeper interpersonal, intrapersonal, and cognitive skills and relationships. And then the competencies. This is a familiar term, most likely, but it's the results of the process of social emotional learning. So the set of attitudes, mindsets, behaviors, skills, what we want to, bucket as competencies here, but it's also the ways in which we are, our ways of being and thinking and feeling and acting and communicating. Competencies sometimes vary across culture, but ultimately, the dispositions, the knowledge, skills, behavior that help people succeed in life and form strong relationships. So if I were to put it in 3 big buckets, we could talk about social, emotional, and cognitive buckets. I want to make a quick point here before we move to the next slide about what SEL is not. And in particular, when we talk about intensive intervention, it's important to note that SEL is not a substitute for mental health services. It certainly is promotive, and it helps folks learn to process and cope with different situations, but it doesn't take the place of intensive intervention. It also doesn't mean that teachers are being asked to serve in the role of a counselor. What it does mean is that we're focused on human growth and development. So does it really work? You probably are here because you believe in it. The evidence is compelling. It shows that SEL can contribute to and improve academic as well as behavioral outcomes. From the original meta-analysis in 2011 by Durlach and colleagues, we consider reduced risks for failure a really important finding for our conversation today. What we know is that SEL makes a difference, and especially given the challenges of the past 2 years, it is more important now than ever. I'm going to take a quick pause here to allow you to read the definition from CASEL on the screen. This is the formal definition that was updated in 2020 as a response to the times we're living in. And I offer the CASEL definition here because the brief that Zach mentioned uses the CASEL competencies for framing and provides strategies related to each competency in each tier for students with intensive needs. You can see those 5 competencies shown here in the center. They're individual skills, but they're also embedded within the larger context of classrooms and schools, homes, and communities. So I'd like to get your sense of familiarity with these. And we're going to launch a quick poll, just curious about how familiar these competencies are with you. That will help us make sure that this session meets your needs. Great, quite familiar. Great, okay, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. A good use of data in social emotional realm is for formative assessment. So thank you for allowing us to do that and get a sense of where you are. I'll offer this on the screen. I'm not going to go through each one, given about more than 50% of you are familiar with the competencies, but you'll have these in the slide deck that will be shared afterwards. It's really notable that the competencies vary across the developmental continuum and that they overlap. So please keep that in mind as we're going to give examples, but there's lots of overlap between the competencies, and that is a good thing.
Great. So now that we've had a chance to kind of explore a little bit of the background about intensive intervention and social and emotional learning, we want to start to draw some connections between these two areas. And so we want to start off by thinking about, from the big picture lens, what are some connections points we can make between these areas, and then we're going to talk more specifically about building the social and emotional competencies of students with intensive needs. So just kind of as a starting point, I think many people recognize that SEL should really be a tier 1 or universal framework for serving all students in the school. And typically it's implemented as that kind of tier 1 process where all students are engaged in the social and emotional learning curriculum or the practices that promote social and emotional learning. So that's important because students with intensive needs are part of tier 1. And so we want to make sure that students with intensive needs benefit from that school-wide approach to SEL. And if you think about SEL as improving the relationships that students have with their teachers and with their peers, this sort of school-wide approach to SEL really can benefit students with intensive needs by improving the conditions in the school overall for all students. And so students with intensive needs really do benefit when this kind of school-wide approach to SEL is implemented. Additionally, we know that students with intensive needs, in addition to that tier 1 level of support, are going to need more intensive and explicit instruction in SEL across the tiers of support. So we can think more concretely about how we can implement more specific SEL practices at tier 2 and tier 3 to support those students. And we can really embed SEL across the tiers of support. Ideally, we're going to create a program in which our tier 2 and tier 3 SEL supports and practices are really well aligned with what's happening with the tier 1 universal SEL program. So, ideally there would be a similar set of target skills that are really well aligned with that tier 1 SEL program. And we would have a common language that could promote consistency across all tiers. And so rather than having, a social skills group that's meeting and not being connected to, the tier 1 curriculum, we want to make sure that, any more targeted or intensive SEL supports really are well aligned with what's happening in tier 1. So those are some starting points to sort of think about this connection between SEL and intensive intervention and how it could be really thought to benefit students across the tiers.
And then thinking about common language, let's talk about what SEL looks like before we dive into some examples. As you well know, SEL can catalyze and facilitate high impact instruction when braided into curriculum and pedagogy. We also know that competence building is most effective when the process, so when SEL is intentional, is sequenced, is active, is focused, explicit, implemented across settings in classrooms as well as grade levels, and embedded into everyday practice. So initially, when we think about the tier 1, what is available to everyone, one way I like to think about it is the 4 E's, which has been adapted language from Duesenberry, Kalin, Demetrovich, and Weisberg's work at CASEL. So as I go through each of these briefly, I'll invite you to think about what SEL looks like in your environment and consider if there are ways to expand it and enrich it as we talk about each briefly. The first is engaging instruction. So this looks like general instructional practices that provide opportunities for skill development and application, as well as social connections and reflection. So at its core, this is good teaching. The second, explicit skill development, is direct instruction. And this is on particular social and/or emotional skills during time typically set aside for SEL. It commonly looks like an evidence-based program being used across a school or in a grade band, but it doesn't have to be an actual box or program. It can also be deliberate instruction on skills. The third E is embedded content, meaning that we're integrating SEL with the academic content in any subject. So weaving the social emotional topics into the existing lessons. It's easier in some subjects than others, but it can be done across the board. And the fourth E, school environment. This refers to school-wide strategies. Zach was talking about this a few minutes ago, but the soup, and the broth in which everything lives. So the school-wide strategies, policies, organizational structures, and the relationships that foster belonging, the competencies of the educators and students that help maintain a safe and supportive and culturally responsive environment. So the reason for breaking things down in these 4 buckets is to help communicate effectively and to operationalize it. The power, of course, is that it can be done in many ways, and the beauty is that you don't have to pick one way. It helps also to be consistent and intentional about how we're doing and what we're doing in regards to SEL. It's been said that SEL is not one more thing on the plate, but it is the plate. And I think that's a nice way to think about it. Let's talk about intensifying these supports across tiers 2 and 3.
Great. So here we have the DBI graphic again. So this is our data-based individualization process. And I mentioned kind of the steps in this DBI process. And so when we think about, where and how SEL can be embedded or infused into this process, this graphic is kind of a starting point for maybe one way that this could happen. So Mara talked about 4 E's, the embedded SEL supports, the explicit SEL instruction, the engaging instruction that we provide. So I think it's really important to recognize that, those 3 E's in particular fit really well into that starting point of DBI, that tier 2 validated intervention program. We want to make sure, of course, that there's engaging instruction in that tier 2 program. Really providing engaging instruction is a core component of delivering with fidelity. We want to make sure that students are engaged, and we want to provide high rates of opportunities to respond to instruction, lots of opportunities for students to practice skills and provide feedback, receive feedback. And so we want to make sure that we're focused on providing that engaging instruction in our tier 2 validated intervention program. And then we have embedded SEL supports and explicit SEL instruction. And I think, both of these can be happening also at that starting point of the DBI process. So we can think about how we can weave SEL practices and supports into our validated intervention program. That may mean providing opportunities for students to work collaboratively with peers, to really provide opportunities for students to be successful engaging with peers. There's a variety of ways that we'll talk more about in the upcoming slides about how to embed those SEL supports within that program. On the other hand, we may have a need to deliver explicit SEL instruction there as well. So, and this doesn't necessarily have to be within a behavioral intervention. It could even be within an academic intervention where we set aside some time in that intervention to deliver some explicit SEL instruction. And that could take a range of forms and really should be tailored to that group's needs or that individual student's needs. But we want to make sure, if needed, we are providing that explicit SEL instruction. And then when we get down to that intervention adaptation stage, we really want to think about how can we intensify the SEL supports or instruction that we're providing. And that can be, that can mean looking at the data that we have and thinking about what are some areas where this student would benefit from some additional SEL supports. And, how can we tailor or modify this intervention in a way that's going to support their social and emotional competencies. So I think that this is kind of a starting point for thinking about how we can bring together the DBI framework that we use in intensive intervention with this idea of explicit, embedded SEL supports, as well as engaging instruction. The fourth E that we're going to talk about, really that school environment, I think is, if I were going to put it on the slide, would be all around the DBI graphic. So, we know that relationships really matter a lot. And so, that's going to be really set the foundation for our success in intervention. So we want to make sure that we're considering that fourth E of school environment that would go kind of all around this graphic. So now we're going to transition to talking a little bit more about some specific SEL strategies to support students with intensive needs. And so these are kind of pretty much pulled from the brief that we shared earlier. And these are, as Mara mentioned, aligned to the 5 CASEL competencies. And so we're going to talk about some potential ways to embed some of these SEL supports within an intensive intervention, but it could also be for students with intensive needs to support them in tier 1 or to intensify intervention, in tier 2 or tier 3. So we'll start with some example strategies for self-awareness and self-management. And so when we think about self-awareness and self-management, we're talking about, those abilities to really reflect on our emotions and to manage our own behavior. And we know that students with intensive needs, this is often, a major challenge. And this is, something that we're working on a lot with these students. Many students with intensive needs have difficulties with self-regulation, with self-management. And so we want to think about how we can provide some scaffolding to support them, as they develop their self-awareness and self-management capabilities. So a few suggestions that we have here. The first one is to help students identify common behavioral triggers and potentially challenging situations in advance. So doing this kind of work with students where they are being reflective about their own behavior or their own behavioral triggers, I think can be a powerful strategy. It kind of aligns with the idea of pre-correction, where we are helping kind of set up students for success before, a behavioral incident might occur. So we want to make sure that we are being proactive in that way, and we can really engage students in that process and make them part of it, as to help enhance their self-awareness. The second one on here is to use a group contingency strategy during academic instruction. So a group contingency strategy could be something like the teacher-student game or the you-me game. And this is a strategy where students earn points for exhibiting expected behaviors or meeting behavioral expectations in class. And I think of this as a way to promote student self-management by providing some scaffolding for students who may be struggling with self-management. And this is kind of a way to support them in that work. So we link to a couple resources related to this strategy that we have available through the NCII website. And so if you're interested, please check that out. And then the third strategy on here is to provide opportunities for students to self-monitor their behavior and graph the data. So self-monitoring has to do with picking a specific positive behavior that the student is going to track over time, and the student can engage in graphing the frequency of that behavior. And so giving students this opportunity to kind of be involved with their own behavior data like this is really a way to promote self-awareness and self-understanding. So I think these are all example strategies that can help students with that work. This slide shows some forms that are available through NCII. On the top left, we have an example self-management form for a younger student whose goal is to listen to their teacher. They would fill in the smiley face or frowny face depending on how they're doing at that time. And it's a way to help students self-reflect and build some of that self-awareness. Another one would be the incredible 5-point scale, which is also available in the resource in the chat. And this is where students are self-rating how they're doing emotionally and thinking about what they need to be successful at that time. On the right side, there's an example of a self-evaluation recording form. And this is an example for an older student. And it's a chance for them to reflect on a behavioral situation that happened and kind of their emotional reaction and some of the decisions that they made or positive or negative choices that they made as a result of that situation. So this kind of self-evaluation is another way to promote self-awareness among students. On the next slide, we have some additional strategies for social awareness and relationship skills. So these strategies really fit into that intrapersonal. So we started with intrapersonal, thinking about our own behavior. And then the next set of strategies really is interpersonal. So thinking about how we are interacting with others, understanding social situations. And so social awareness and relationship skills are the two competencies there. And social awareness has to do with understanding the emotions of others, being able to empathize with others and build those positive relationships. So some suggestions here are to engage students in cross-age tutoring or mentoring. And so, this can be a powerful strategy for students with intensive needs. They can be successful as tutors sometimes for, potentially for younger students. And this is a way to really help students kind of build some of that social awareness and kind of develop some of those relationship skills. The next example on here is to provide opportunities for students to practice those relationship skills in small groups like lunch buddies or social skills groups. And this would be an example of that explicit SEL instruction like we talked about in a kind of set aside time for SEL specifically. Important to note here that, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure these small groups are focused on social and emotional skills that are well aligned with the Tier 1 curriculum, so that they're not happening in isolation from everything else that's happening in the school. And then finally, on this slide is the suggestion to use role play to help students empathize with and understand the perspectives of others. And I think this can be a strategy that could be woven into academic instruction. It can be used in classes like social studies or language arts, or of course within social skills groups where students are using role play to understand how others are feeling, to understand the perspectives of others. And so these are all kind of suggestions for how we might work on these skills with students with intensive needs. And I think it's important to say, of course, we need to provide lots of structure, lots of scaffolding as we work with students on these types of activities.
Thanks for the great example, Zach. Thinking about the 4 E's. As people I'm sure are noting, there's overlap between them, just as there are in the competencies. We've talked a lot about the first 3 E's, so we wanted to spend a moment here on the 4th, the school environment. We all know that young people, as well as adults, are better able to learn when they feel safe, when they feel supported, where relationships are strong, where they have the freedom to learn, to practice, to make mistakes, to get feedback. Recognizing students' strengths, considering ways to improve peer interactions and social dynamics, and including student voice are all ways that we can foster belonging. These are many things that you all do all of the time, and I encourage you to figure out what is the next level. Is there a way to recognize students for their strengths and their assets? Are there dynamics in the classroom? Is there any bullying happening? Can you take an active role in supporting and facilitating positive social interactions? I read about a teacher recently who, at the end of every Friday, reflected on all of the students, put notes in her grade book about any students that she saw looking left out from different groupings, or even during social time, and then rearrange her groupings on purpose the next week based on the level of belonging that she noticed. And that was really powerful. And finally, here is talking about student voice. We can always include young people in the decision-making, and sharing power really facilitates a sense of belonging. And peer relationships, much in the same vein, can be an important part of improving the school environment for everyone, including students with intensive needs. There, of course, are a variety of ways to do this, both inside the classroom and across the school. That can include things like peer-mediated instruction, cooperative learning strategies, as well as peer group strategies. So clubs, sports, service learning opportunities, ways in which you can interact in a group. Peer learning in particular is effective because it provides time for both connection and instruction. So opportunities to respond as well as to give and receive feedback. All of these are skills, of course, we know that last a lifetime. So I'll pause there and hand it back to Zach.
Great, thanks, Mara. So another piece of the school environment that we want to also focus on is our partnering with families and others in the community to support intensive intervention. And so, I know that many of you, of course, are very familiar with this idea, and we always want to emphasize the importance of including families in this work. So NCII has some resources around partnering with families and some infographics about intensive intervention that are intended for families. And so we want to make sure that we're sharing information with families, but ideally it's not just a one-way sharing of information where it's all going from the school to the family, but really thinking about how can we foster two-way communication between school and the family to really be hearing from families about their experiences and kind of what they think is going to be most effective for their students. So we want to invite parents to participate in the DBI process. And when we think about what that might look like, it could certainly mean inviting parents to any decision-making meeting that's occurring, help them participate in the problem-solving process. So, coming up with a plan for the intervention and any adaptations that might be occurring. Those are places where we can include families in that process. We don't want special education to be the first time that families are invited to the table to participate in that kind of problem solving. this should really be happening well before a student is identified as requiring special education. So I want to make sure that as part of this DBI process, we're really thinking about how are we engaging the families. And, as the frequency of our data collection and intensity of instruction is increasing as we go from, tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, we should really be thinking about the level of communication with families should also be increasing as we go, across those tiers. And then the last point here on the slide is just to make sure that we're asking parents and families for information about their child. And, families often have a lot to share about, what might be effective for their child. And so we want to really take that into consideration in our DBI process. So those are some general considerations about partnering with families. And I think they fit in well with our connections between SEL and DBI. So our last competency that we're going to touch on here has to do with responsible decision-making. And so when we talk about responsible decisions, we want to make sure that we're supporting students to make those caring decisions and, providing practice for students to have the opportunities to make those decisions. And so we have a few recommendations related to this competency as well. Our first one is to partner with families to align reinforcement strategies across home and school. So for example, we may be working with a student who has a daily behavior report card. If that student earns all their points in a day, maybe they earn a reinforcer at school as well as at home, or there is some connection between what's going on at school and what's going on at home. And a daily behavior report card can certainly help with that school to home communication. And NCII has some resources related to using that daily behavior report card as well. Another idea is to use a choice menu to help students practice responsible decision-making. So a choice menu, there's an example linked in the slide deck available through NCII, helps students, provide students a set of choices that they can, access at any time to help them with decision-making. And so this is a way to provide a sort of scaffold or support for students to help them with, making those responsible decisions. And then finally, we talked about earlier this idea of a reflection sheet. Students can use a reflection sheet to evaluate their behavior following a conflict or a behavioral incident. And we want to, give students opportunities, again, to reflect on their behavior, but also to make sure that we're giving them opportunities to self-evaluate as well as practice those decision-making opportunities. So those are some examples of responsible decision-making. In the brief, there are some additional examples, and they're offered at the various tiers. So strategies at tier 1 as well as strategies at tiers 2 and tier 3. So we're going to turn next to sharing some resources to support SEL for students with intensive needs. And some of these have been already shared as we mentioned, but we'll go through some of these resources that are currently out there. And we invite you all, of course, to share anything else with us in the chat. So the first one is this NCII SEL brief that we talked about. And that's really the framing for our discussion today. It has a table which includes a list of strategies that can be used in each of the competencies to support students with intensive needs in tier 1, as well as in tier 2 and tier 3. So that's available on the NCII website. In addition, we have lots of strategies related to behavioral principles and behavioral strategies. And so, I think one thing to point out here is that there is somewhat of a distinction between a behavior intervention and the idea of social and emotional learning. And so while there's some nuance there, I think when we talk about the behavioral strategies, there's a little bit there's many resources on the NCII website currently related to supporting behavioral intervention. And so there are strategies related to antecedent modification, self-management, and reinforcement. And those strategies can be incorporated into an academic intervention, and as well as, support students, in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. On the right side of the screen, we have our behavior support for intensive intervention course, and that's a series of 8 modules, which can be used for course content to learn a lot about what behavior intervention looks like, and that's also available on the NCII website. NCII also has tools charts, which you may be familiar with, and these are charts to learn about what's out there in terms of resources and tools to for both assessment and intervention in academics and behavior. So the behavior tools charts, the one that's on the screen here, is the behavior intervention tool chart, and you can see it's a way to summarize some of the evidence behind a particular intervention or assessment tool, and that's a great place to look for resources like behavior interventions, as well as behavior progress monitoring and screening tool, information about behavior progress monitoring and screening. One resource that we also wanted to share is this toolkit that came out and was a collaboration between CASEL as well as folks here at AIR and folks at CCSSO. And this toolkit really lays out some of the big ideas about integrating MTSS and SEL more broadly. And so there's some great recommendations in here, really aimed more at school and at state and district leaders for thinking about how SEL and MTSS can be connected. And so earlier we talked about belonging, the idea of fostering student belonging. And for those of you who are interested in students with more significant disabilities or working with students with more significant disabilities, I really encourage you to check out this Progress Center webinar on belonging and the work of Dr. Eric Carter, who's really done a lot of work around fostering belonging for students with disabilities. And so I mentioned more significant disabilities, but I think this work really applies broadly. And it's a great framework for promoting belonging among all students, and with a particular emphasis on students with disabilities. So there's a webinar on the Progress Center website, which I encourage you to check out. And in terms of students with more significant disabilities, again, the TIES Center is a resource to also know about and check out. And they have some great resources on peer engagement. So if you're interested in strategies for building connections among students with disabilities or students with intensive needs and the general population of students, they have a lot of really great information about strategies to build those connections for students. So we really encourage you to check out those resources, and I think there's a good link between SEL and this idea of belonging. Great, so we're gonna have some time for questions. So if you haven't put in a question, we encourage you to do so, and I'll turn it over to Eliza.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, good reminder. If you have thought of any questions during the webinar, feel free to send that in the Q&A or chat pod, and we'll hopefully get to a few. I see some questions have come in, around data collection. So Zach and Mara, maybe you can speak to some considerations for collecting data on student progress with social emotional learning.
Great. So Mara, do you want to take a first pass at this related to data and SEL?
Okay, sure. Yeah, it's a common question. People really love using data, and for good reason. data collection will help us understand whether and how we're creating the conditions for social emotional learning and development. And these data are important for lots of reasons, including being able to provide equitable supports and outcomes, so based on student need, and helping identify students who need more intensive support. In the realm of SEL, we recommend focusing on implementation data because it can provide insights about dosage, frequency, duration of the social emotional supports, and be used to continuously improve in a formative way. That fidelity data is useful. School climate data is also useful for monitoring implementation of social emotional learning. Did the adults do what they say they would do? And are they creating an environment in which they feel safe and students feel safe? So student voice being really important in the school climate data. I think it's important just to note that the decision to use any assessment should be grounded in clear purpose. It's best when it's strength focused. We don't recommend SEL or social emotional competencies be measured for any high stakes decision making because they develop over time. And as students mature, it's important to think about the developmental spectrum and that the measures may be normed based on a limited sample. And so really being thoughtful about your student population, being sensitive to students' lived experiences, as well as their developmental stage is really important when thinking about data collection.
I would just add that for intensive intervention and for DBI, we really rely on data and we rely on progress monitoring and diagnostic data. So we want to make sure that any intervention that's happening, there is progress monitoring data that's being collected. But that's different than collecting data on social and emotional competencies specifically. So I just wanted to make that distinction that when we think about data collection with DBI, we certainly do want to encourage progress monitoring. And that's more of a formal data collection process with a valid and reliable approach to data collection. Progress monitoring tools should be able to be used frequently, they should be brief, and they should be reliable and valid. And so for DBI, we want to make sure that progress monitoring is happening, and we can use our other sources of data, our diagnostic data, to really help us with that problem-solving process.
A couple other questions that are coming in here.
Yeah, we're getting a lot. I see a few questions. I know you spoke previously about getting some family engagement, and some folks are wondering if you have any other guidance on working with families if there is maybe a disconnect on teaching social and emotional skills, or any responding to pushback from families. And really getting everyone on the same page about their students' social emotional learning.
I would say one thing that related to family engagement generally is just to make sure we're getting on the right foot with families from the beginning. And it shouldn't be that the first time we have contact with a family is around a problem behavior or a problem that's occurring. So we want to make sure we are recognizing the positive things that students are doing in the classroom and reaching out to families and making sure they're aware of the positive things that we see. And I think that can really go a long way to developing those relationships with families. Some other strategies could be things like making sure, sending home a letter at the beginning of the school year, kind of asking for information about the family, gathering, doing home visits or gathering information about the family early in the school year. Really trying to establish that relationship early on, I think is important for setting yourself up for success with families.
Ooh, Zach, you're making me think too, there's a recent report or article out by the Fordham Institute that talked about families and SEL And they did a wide survey, and it turns out that most of the families said, yes, SEL is important, but not when you call it SEL. So I think, again, language matters, words matter. Find out how they talk about your constituents, your stakeholders. How are they speaking about the skills in which that help kids succeed? Sometimes I ask families, what is it that you wish you would have learned in school, or you wish your students would learn in school? That's not, sort of traditional math, English, science, history. And that's sort of the way into the conversation, really making sure that you're using people's language. And also in multilingual contexts as well, important to bring in other ways of speaking. I can speak to the trauma question if that
yeah, go ahead.
Cool. The state of Alaska has a really great trauma-informed framework that they've put a lot of time and energy into. So I'll get that into the chat. I think one thing that's really important, I work closely with the folks who deliver our trauma-sensitive schools work. And the most important thing with the trauma sensitivity is thinking about not just aligning it with SEL, but actually integrating it. It can't be a separate thing than social emotional learning. SEL should be trauma sensitive. If it's not, then maybe we need to take a look at how we're doing it. And so, making sure that the folks in your building or in your district are aligned, that those trauma informed care and social emotional learning aren't happening in different silos. That's really the key. And I don't know of any arts-based SEL programs for students with intensive intervention, but it's a really good question, and I bet some exist, so I'll look into that.
All right, well, I know there are a few more questions, but we do have to unfortunately start wrapping up. If you have lingering questions, you can definitely reach out to us at intensiveintervention.org. As well as, you can connect with our presenters for lingering questions. But we just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to our presenters, Zach and Mara. A recording will be available on our website, as well as slides and all of the linked resources. So thanks everyone for joining. Hope you learned something new.